We're going to talk about complex numbers today. When you take the square root of a negative number, your answer is an imaginary number. This is new this year. So in the past, if you got the square root of, for instance, -2, you would say it had no real solution, and you would leave it like that. Now we're going to have these i's involved so that we can represent those numbers. So square root of -1 is I. This is super, 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 super important. You must know that. So a couple of quick examples. If I take the square root of -4, in the past we have said non-real solution. Now you're going to kind of split it. So if you remember how to split, it's like the square root of -1, square root of 4. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of -1 we now know is I. So we get 2I. Square root of -100, we can split that as well. So that's going to be the square root of -1, square root of 100. So that's going to give us 10I. You don't necessarily have to show these steps here. I'm just showing you so that you understand kind of how we're figuring it out. When combined with a real number, counterpart is known as a complex number. The standard form for these are our real part plus our imaginary part. So if you have 3 plus 2i, 3 is the real one, 2i is our imaginary part. Every single number, whether it's imaginary or real, can be written as a complex number. So we're just going to show these in standard form. So standard form has our real and imaginary parts. So we got plus or minus the square root of -9. So we know, first of all, that I can split this up and simplify that. So we get plus or minus square root -1, square root 9. So we're going to have plus or minus square root of 9 is 3i. I don't have a real part, so I'm just going to put 0 there. And now it's in standard form. For 5, there's nothing to simplify. This is real. I don't have an imaginary part, so if I went in standard form, I can just say plus 0i, because if you add 0 to it, you don't change it. For 3, square root of -25, square root of -1, square root of 25 plus 7. Square root of 25 I know is 5, and that's going to be I for square root of -1. So we get 5i plus 7. We went in standard form, so we want our real part, then our imaginary part. So I'm going to just rewrite as 7 plus 5i, because addition is commutative. And then our last one, square root of -64 minus 3. So square root of -1, square root of 64 minus 3. Square root of 64 is 8. We're going to get I from -1 minus 3. Again, I went in standard form, so I want my real part first. My real part is a -3 plus 8i. This is positive here, and we are allowed to do that as well, because we could say this is like a plus -3. We just don't usually write that down. For powers of I, we're going to learn something really, really cool. So we know I to the first power is just going to be square root of -1, or I. Anything to the power of 1 is just itself. Now I squared, and I'm going to write it over here so you can kind of see something hopefully happening. So I1 equals I squared equals, we know I is really a square root of -1, so I squared would be 2 of those. We know that if you have a square root squared, it undoes it, so we're going to get -1 there. For I cubed, square root -1, square root -1, square root -1, that's going to give us -I. We basically have another I. Because this right here is -1, and I know this is I. I to the fourth is square root -1, square root -1, square root -1, square root -1. And that is going to be